Hi, my name is Elizabeth Swanson, and I am the International Baccalaureate Middle Years Program Coordinator at the American School of Warsaw in Warsaw, Poland. I'm also a middle school science teacher. I'm from Colorado originally, so if you're wondering how I got involved with Camle, that's how. I've been to Camle many times. Today, we're going to talk about creating space for formative assessment.
Hi, I'm Natalie Dudley. Elizabeth and I are doing this together because we started both our very first teaching jobs in Loveland, Colorado at Conrad Ball Middle School. I currently teach at Preston Middle School, which is in Fort Collins, Colorado, sixth grade English language arts. I also am an adjunct professor at CSU, and I've been in some different roles as a teacher leader and literacy support coach. And we are excited to talk today about creating formative or space for formative assessment because when we first started our teaching careers, the wonderful Diane Lauer, who many of you might know, introduced us or really helped us start thinking about this concept and what it means in our classrooms.
Diane was our first principal.
And we're forever indebted to her.
Yes. Also, we should point out that we are currently an 8 hours time difference between us. So I just finished school and Natalie just got to school.
Yes. All right. We have tried to make the video practical and not too boring. So thank you for choosing our session.
All right. We look forward to meeting you at the end. All right, so in order to create space for formative assessment, we first need to think about this idea of what it is and what it is not. So as you can see very largely on the screen, formative assessment is not grading. That's a key piece of this, that it's not grading. But what it is the systematic gathering of evidence with the express goal of improving student achievement. So we're constantly, as teachers, gathering evidence just by being in the classroom, but it's this idea that it's very intentional and it's systematic. And it's a process we engage in with learners and not just to learners, that students are part of the process because it's a partnership between the teacher and the student to actually move students closer to the learning goals. And Natalie's going to talk a lot later about how to establish those learning goals and what that actually means in the idea of formative assessment. It's also the purpose, as stated above, is the idea of improving student achievement, but it's also to increase learner independence. As a sixth grade teacher, I can tell you that many a day, students will try to follow me around with their work asking, is this good? Is this good? Is this good? Is this good? I'm sure that's happened to every teacher. And a couple of years ago, I had a student who just like made me nuts. And I started to think to myself, wow, I need to help her be able to answer for herself, is this good? And so I have become much more intentional in the last couple of years about helping students answer the question for themselves, is this good? And with that, it's this idea that formative assessment is not a thing. It's an overall stance or philosophy. It's an approach. It's how everything can run in the classroom. It's through the planning, it's through the teaching, it's through the conversations that you have with students. I worked with a teacher a lot last year who didn't think she was collecting enough formative assessment data until I went to observe her a few times, and I noticed that she had 43 separate conversations with individual students during the course of that lesson and was making notes about those conversations. And I said to her, well, you are doing formative assessment. That's not just a thing. This is your overall approach in your classroom, that you have constant conversations with students. So I just want to stress that it's not grading. It is the idea of gathering of evidence. And that is kind of a switch sometimes for people, that it's a gathering of evidence. So it is not a test or a series of tests, which that doesn't mean that it can never be a test style thing, because sometimes teachers use test style questions to be able to help students understand where they are in relation to being able to achieve on a particular test. It is, and I think this is the key here, this is not a pre-packaged program or set of techniques to adopt. This is the idea that we are meeting the learning needs of the human beings sitting right in front of us. If we see that the learning goal is here and one student is here and one student is here, they don't need the same formative assessment feedback to be able to move towards that learning goal. So this idea of a stance means it's not an add-on or an extra thing. It's just what you're doing all the time. And many teachers are doing this all the time. The difference is that it's really planned for and systematic. And Natalie's going to talk more about the idea of the planning and systematizing of collecting of evidence.
All right. So Liz talked about what formative assessment is not, and now I'm going to dive in with you guys to really explain more of how or what formative assessment is, but actually what that might look like in a classroom. So before we get into the real nitty-gritty of it, we had to talk about this idea of making a plan. And we know that all teachers are planners, right? Or at least we have a lot of planning to do as teachers, whether we want to or not. The first thing we really have to think about is this idea that we have to design a culminating summative task. And it has to be open-ended enough so that kids have different entry points, different access points, open-ended enough so that we can actually gather data on how kids are doing in terms of their progress toward the goal. This, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking in this session about it. This is stuff teachers know about. You could look at the work of Wiggins and McTighe with Understanding by Design, and also think about just all sorts of backwards planning curriculums that already exist. So you make a plan, you have an open-ended culminating task, and then you really consider what is it that students need to know, understand, and be able to do. And this is where the long-term and short-term learning targets come in. Learning targets are essential for me when I think about formative assessment. Because if I want to know how students are doing, if I want to collect data and evidence about that, I need to know how they're doing in reference to a certain point. That's where the long-term learning targets come in, and the short-term ones as well. So one of the most influential books for helping me think about how to plan using long-term learning targets and then daily learning targets with assessment evidence was Samantha Bennett's chapter from the book Comprehension Going Forward. Her section was called Fulfilling the Promise of All Students Can. And she says this: when teachers know what they want their students to know, do, and understand, determine the concrete evidence before the lessons begin, and share those goals and products with the students through systematic routines and rituals, all students can become the powerful, thoughtful human beings with whom we want to share our world. Really, what this talks about is how we can use formative assessment, not just for ourselves to know how kids are doing, but we can teach kids how to use these tools and how they can use all of their resources to access an end goal or a long-term target. So learning targets, when you're designing learning targets or writing them, you have to think about, okay, what do kids need to know, understand, and do? Then, oh yeah, this graphic is great. I love this graphic, because it helps us think about why tasks need to be open-ended and also how learning targets provide different entry points for kids. So if the target is right here at the top of the diving board, we know that some kids are going to need lots of supports to make it up there, right? But we also know that some kids are already like, I know how to do a back dive off the diving board. Some students can launch from this. When you have a clear learning target, it helps kids see the path. Either like, I need to do X, Y, and Z to reach the target, or, ooh, I'm already at this target, and now I can launch myself further, maybe even looking to the next grade level or to the next advanced level of whatever the work is you're approaching with kids. So one thing that helps me is thinking about the learning targets I'm writing, and am I writing effective learning targets, ones that actually work within this idea of formative assessment. So the book Where Great Teaching Begins by Ann Reeves has a great tool that I use often. It's called the Hey Dad Watch Me test. So when I'm thinking about writing learning targets, I need to think about, okay, do they identify what kids need to know, understand, and do? Will they help me as a teacher? And also, will they help kids? So I always like to think about swimming. My youngest daughter is a great swimmer now on swim team, but she was so scared of the water and couldn't swim. So it wasn't like I just gave up on her, right? I didn't put her in the water and say, well, show me your freestyle and say, ooh, that's a level 1. Sorry, not yet. Of course not. I had to give her lots of scaffolds and supports to reach this target. And finally, when she started being more independent, I had to give her feedback. So I couldn't just say, oh, that's a 2, that's your score. I needed to give her specific feedback to help her reach her goal. If you think about the Hey Dad, Watch Me test or the Hey Mom, Watch Me test, hey Mom, watch me do freestyle. I can watch her, I can look at her, and I can give her specific feedback about her stroke, about her kick, about her breathing to help her reach her goal. Again, I love using non-examples to help. So if my target was, I can, let's go to a more specific English example now. So my unit planner here that we're in right now has to do with narrative writing. And I've got a long-term target down here. I always plan my units with essential questions and big ideas, but we'll, for our purposes, look at the long-term targets. It says, I can use the writing process to write a powerful personal narrative that is structured and I can elaborate to show what my story is really about. That's our long-term target. Kids look at that and they either think like, I know how to do this, or they're like, what are you talking about? So of course, I have lots of steps along the way to help them reach that. So here is an example of a couple of the daily targets that we've been using to help reach that goal. So one day last week, our target was, I can study another author's writing to try their techniques in my own. So let's try the Hey Dad test. So Hey Dad, watch me study this other author's technique and watch me use it in my own writing. I can actually do that, right? Like I can watch you look at this author. You can point to the text and say, here's what I tried and here it is in my own writing. I can see that. I can give them feedback about that. Another example target says, I can tell details of the story when writing exactly the way the narrator perceived them in that moment. This is a great example. We look at a mentor text, a very powerful one, and then I have kids who this specific lesson changes their writing in an incredible way. And they write stories that blow me away. I feel like I'm right there with them in this emotional moment. I'm standing right by their side. And then there's other kids who are definitely trying to do this. They're trying to tell the story from the narrator's perspective exactly as it happened, but they're at different levels. Because my long-term target is around an open-ended task, I have provided a myriad of entry points for my students. They're all going to be performing at different levels, and that's okay. My job isn't to make them all be cookie cutters of each other. My job is to help move them from wherever they are through different feedback and formative assessment. Now, if I had a learning target that said, I can understand an author's technique, that's tricky. If you think about the Hey Dad test, hey Dad, watch me understand this. Like, what does that really look like? So the reason we bring up the information or the plug for the Hey Dad test is because that can really help frame your learning targets in a way that actually help them be more useful to you for formative assessment. So what does evidence of learning look like for those learning targets? Well, in my classroom, I'm going to be looking at student writing, either in their notebook or in Google Classroom. Also, I might be listening to kids talk, having conferences with their peers. Right now, that's in a breakout room, right? And not at a small table. Or it might be the conversations I'm having with the kids. Ultimately, what I'm trying to do is to consider how can I support kids with this feedback loop so that the formative assessment data not only helps me know where they are in their spectrum here of learning, but it also helps them know where they are in terms of how are they doing on their path to meeting the long-term target. So one more plug. When we think about tools and how we can help kids become more assessment capable and help them become more independent learners, I also really try to give kids resources that they can use. So in my class, kids have a writing partner. They use mentor text. They use anchor charts. They have written individual writing goals, and they have a checklist that really divides it among proficiencies. So all of these are tools that I've taught the kids how to use and I've used with them. But I also want to give them those formative assessment tools to use on their own. Because at the end of the day, I'm not going to be the one that's the most available to help them, right? I want them to help grow their independence as writers so that when they go to a high school class or when they are in college and they don't have a teacher running a writer's workshop, they know what to do. They know how to access tools. They know how to check their progress. They can formatively assess themselves, even if a teacher is not doing that for them.
As Natalie talked about, it's really important to know where your overall unit is going in order to plan your day-to-day learning targets. So in my unit 1 with my current students, I know that we are going to have to plan and conduct our own experiments. And so all of the learning targets that I have developed for the day-to-day learning take that idea and knowing what's required exactly from that idea and breaking it down into the day-to-day. And I every day share our day-to-day learning target with my students, and we write them in our journal. And just having them posted or having them up is not really the point. The idea is that we unpack it, we talk about it, we make sure that, well, we, as in we, the teachers planning these lessons, are ensuring that whatever it is we've designed as the learning engagement is really going to match that exact learning target. So I picked this one in particular to show because it says without help from Miss Swanson. And so graphing is a key skill, and graphing with Google Sheets is something that I know that students have never done before. And so I created a sample of the exact kind of graph that they would need to make, and I posted it on the board and I froze the screen, and then we talked about how do you figure something out if no one's there to help you. And we watched this video of students, of these people being stuck on an escalator. And so we talk, kids think it's hilarious. Why don't they just walk up the escalator? And so by having this conversation, we've really set the tone that you are in charge of looking at the sample and going back and looking at yours. And that is a tiny little way to do some really easy student-driven formative assessment. Does this that I have put up on the board look like yours? No? Okay, well, you're not done. It's not good. And so we've been able to come back to this same idea over and over again as students are progressing in the skills. So I know exactly what knowledge, understanding, and skills students will need to have in order to be successful at the end of the unit on our end of unit learning goals. And every day I plan for a small piece and a small step forward in doing that. So in this particular question of the day that I'd like to show, I talked about, or it says write down evidence of, it says, what did we write down as evidence? So every day I walk around and look at students' journals to see how they've answered the question of the day. If students are unable to answer this question and still have no idea what the word evidence means, which is a key term in our unit, I have quick data right there in front of me about how I would adjust this. The other day we were calculating averages, and they're new to 6th grade, so I wasn't sure if they knew how to calculate an average. And when I asked for students to show how they would do it, a bunch of them didn't know how. And so that was good data for me as a teacher to figure out where I need to meet the learners who are right there in front of my face. Always knowing where we're going. It's this idea that I have really clearly identified the knowledge, understanding, and skills that students will need to get to the end point of this unit. All right, I also just wanted to show a little bit of my plan and my planner to show how I do this. So I specifically chose this box because you can see that at the end point, I know that students have to present transformed data in a graph. That's what is required in my science class within the MYP. And so some of these might come from standards or come from some of the required capabilities of whatever it is that you are using to create your curriculum. So in mine, it says I can present, or students have to be able to present, which means put it into a graph, transformed data. And transformed means they have to do a mathematical calculation. Well, if I just said that to a sixth grader, that would be completely, they don't know what that means. So what that really means is that they can create a graph in Google Sheets. They can choose the correct graph type. They can select and put the correct variables on the correct axis, and they can create a title for the graph that shows the variables it represents. So these are the smaller learning targets that will allow them to get to the presenting their transformed data in a graph. And these are things that I have broken down and we actually work on step by step. I just wanted to show the same thing from a couple months or a month later, where we have built onto our learning target because they can already create a graph in Google Sheets because we have been able to check that off. And now we're working on using the mean, which is the mathematical calculation. So the thing I want to point your attention to is down where it says make a list in your journal about what you think a good graph would have. We've already made several graphs. They've made them on their own and they help each other because Miss Munson doesn't help with that. And we came up together with this list based on what they wrote in their journal about what a good graph will have. So when you think back to the learning targets I just talked about for my unit, for the day-to-day, these very same things appear here. So a good graph has a title, axis labels, etc. So the thing that allows them to have some self-empowerment is this idea that it's been slowly building, and so the targets are achievable, and then they can go back and use the previous learning to do the next learning. And a huge piece of that is because of those targets at the end. And so this allows me to see where individual students are and how I might be able to help move them forward. This also, side note, has allowed some particular students really to shine because I've asked them to help each other, and some of them are really able to help each other on this. So where this saves me time, yes, it's a lot of upfront planning, but I don't have to collect a bunch of graphs, take them home and grade them. That sounds like a horrible idea to me. I don't want to spend my evenings doing that. First of all, they check each other's and they tell each other, no, you're missing this, you're missing this, you're missing this. And so though the work for a teacher is a lot more in the upfront, I don't end up having to take as many things home because of the fact that every day I'm seeing what students are working on in relation to the learning target, and I can give them in the moment feedback when it matters most. So even on big projects, as I'm circulating, as they're working on the big projects, I have students insert the feedback that I'm giving them right there into their document in writing so that they remember the conversation that we had. Of course, sometimes I also go into their documents and insert feedback, but my feedback is purposeful because I know where the unit is going. And so I've created this space where kids are able to just continuously move forward by knowing where it's going. And in my departments that I've been in for the last 15 years as a teacher, I think I have been a broken record about learning targets. Because to me, I don't even know how I would start a unit if I didn't know where it is going. It's the same thing even with teachers who I work with in terms of planning professional development. I have to know what our endpoint is and what the outcomes are for the day to be able to try to strategically plan and create learning targets around where we need to go.
All right. So final thoughts for you today. Really, we hope some of your takeaways are that you can think about really setting yourself and your students up for success. So in order to make formative assessment work for you, you have to be proactive. Make sure or really try to think about designing open-ended tasks for your students. Frame those with long-term learning targets and also the day-to-day or the shorter-term learning targets that lead up to that long-term target.
As I mentioned before, it's always important to remember that planning is a part of being a teacher. And so it's really about how and when you allocate your planning time in this process. And so the planning time in teaching this way really comes more in the beginning. And then once you have these things set, you can really just move through your day to day, knowing where you're going, and it makes it so much easier for everybody involved.
All right. Thank you so much. Please reach out if you have any questions or want us to send you any of our resources that you can't find in our packet. We're happy to chat. Thank you.
Thank you.